Hey everyone, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to part 22 of my Music Theory for Producers course. In part 21, we went over all of the available 7th chords to use in major keys. In this video, I want to cover all of the available 7th chords in minor keys, including alterations of the minor scale. So just to recap quickly on the last video, when we build triads in a major key and add diatonic sevenths to the top of each triad, we ended up with 7th chords with 4 distinct qualities. So in major keys, the 1 and 4 chords we found were major 7th chords, which have a major triad with a major 7th stacked on top. The 2, 3, and 6 chords were minor 7th chords, which have a minor triad with a minor 7th on top. The 5 chord was a dominant or major minor 7th chord, which is a major triad with a minor 7th on top. And lastly, the 7 chord was a half diminished 7th chord, which is a diminished triad with a minor 7th on top. I also briefly mentioned the fully diminished 7th chord, which doesn't naturally exist in major or minor keys without altering the scale. It's a diminished triad with a diminished 7th on top, but we'll come back to that one in just a bit. Also, if you're a bit rusty on this, go back and rewatch part 21, where I explain the form of each of these 7th chords in more detail. So let's start with all of the triads in natural minor. Minor 1, diminished 2, major 3, minor 4, minor 5, major 6, major 7, and then minor 1 again. If you need a recap on minor triads, go back and check out part 12 of this series. I've mentioned this before, but note that the 1 chord in a minor key is relative to the 6 chord in a major key, and each successive chord is relative as well, following the same pattern. So the pattern of triad qualities is the same, you're just starting 6 on 1 in minor. Likewise, the pattern of 7th chords is the same too. So in minor keys, at least in natural minor that is, the diatonic 7th chords that naturally exist in the key are minor 7th for the 1 chord, half diminished 7th for the 2 chord, major 7th for the 3 chord, minor 7th for the 4 chord, minor 7th for the 5 chord, major 7th for the 6 chord, and dominant or major minor 7th for the 7 chord. So even with just this knowledge alone, we have a new level of harmony that we can use to juice up a song's chord progression in a minor key. I don't want to say that there's no rhyme or reason to it, but when it comes to extended harmony beyond triads, I find it just a compositional choice and a textural choice as to whether I use a 7th chord or a triad at any particular point in my song. It also depends on the scoring and melody of the song too. If your vocal melody or other instruments are clashing with a 7th chord, I may find it a bit too dense sounding harmonically and omit a 7th chord in favor of a triad. Also, especially on the 1 chord, there's a sense of finality that you can get from a triad as opposed to the lingering sound of a 7th chord. Let's take a listen to a simple piano, bass, and vocal example I came up with. First with just triads, and then with some triads substituted for 7th chords. The key is A minor. Note that in the 7th chord example, I omitted the 5th of each 7th chord. This is also just a good rule of thumb for note omission. If you have to omit a note from a chord or triad, omit the 5th, because that's the least important part of the chord when it comes to establishing harmony, and it's also the most static note in the chord. So let's give this a listen.
One of these days I will finally give in, but today is not that day. Oh Lord, I've worked too hard just to give up now. Your words mean nothing if you can't commit. One of these days I will finally give in, but today is not that day. Oh Lord, I've worked too hard just to give up now. Your words mean nothing if you can't commit.
So also keep in mind the 3 different forms of the minor scale that we discussed way back in part 9 of this series. The arrangement of 7th chords that you're seeing right now only applies to natural minor. So let's first talk about harmonic minor. Remember that in harmonic minor, the 7th scale degree is raised, therefore giving us the option of a major 5 chord or a diminished 7 chord. This alteration creates a dominant or major minor 7th chord on the 5 chord. The dominant 7th on 5 creates a really strong pull to the minor 1 chord. Harmonic minor also creates a fully diminished 7th chord on the 7 chord. Just a note on the fully diminished 7th, technically it's just called a diminished 7th chord, but I often call it fully diminished just to make sure to distinguish it from half diminished. Fully diminished 7ths are diminished triads with a diminished 7th on top. An interval of a diminished 7th is 9 semitones, so enharmonically it's the same as a major 6th, but it's notated as a different enharmonic. Fully diminished 7ths also have a very strong pull to the 1 chord. Raising the 7th in harmonic minor also creates the odd-sounding minor major 7th chord on the 1 chord. It's a minor triad with a major 7th. This one's very uncommon unless it's intentionally used for dissonance. In a lot of music theory textbooks, it's not even mentioned in this context, but it does exist. Now let's talk about some common 7th chords that come from melodic minor. Remember that in melodic minor, the 6th and 7th scale degrees are raised. So we said previously that this creates a minor 2 chord, a major 4 chord, and a diminished 6 chord, in addition to the major 5 and diminished 7 created by harmonic minor. The 7th chords that come from this are the minor 7th on the 2 chord instead of half diminished, a dominant or major minor 7th chord on the 4 chord instead of minor 7th, and less commonly the half diminished 7th chord on the 6 chord instead of a minor 7th. This last one works well if you want to push to a major 7 chord and then usually back to 1. Out of all of the harmonic and melodic minor alterations, the ones that seem to be used the most are the dominant 7th chords on 4 and 5, the minor 7th on 2, and the fully diminished 7th on 7. Here's an example of using a dominant 7th on 5 and a diminished 7th on 7. Next, here's an example of using a minor 7th on 2 instead of using a half diminished chord. Alright guys, so that's it for this video. Keep in mind that the deeper and more complex we get with harmony, the less structured it is and the less rules there are. Like I said before, I don't want you to think that there isn't any rhyme or reason to it, but when it comes to extended harmony, it becomes less about following the traditional rules of music theory and more about a textural or compositional choice from the songwriter. Does the added harmony sound good to your ear and better than using just triads? If the answer is yes, then use 7th chords where you feel they're appropriate and enhance the music, and don't use them where they don't. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.